Picture this. You're sitting in the roaring amphitheater of Rome. The sun burns down on marble seats. The earth thick with sweat wine and the metallic hang of blood around you. 50,000 voices. Thunder as two figures step into the sand at. Balance you expect to see men are a giant swords flashing. Shields raised, but no. These are women. Their hair hacked short like soldiers. Their bodies oiled, bruised, and scarred. They grip weapons almost too heavy for them, yet they are for, like as if their lives mean nothing for the Romans. This is entertainment for the women. It is a death sentence in disguise. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the brutal truths of history, make sure hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden chapters from the past, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed how these ancient horrors connect us across time and place, as if history shadows reach into every corner of the modern world. The idea of gladiators known as gladiators sounds almost mythical today, but they were very real. Their existence has been confirmed not just by ancient texts, but by archaeological discoveries, relief carvings showing armed women in combat, and even skeletons. Plains bearing the scars of battle, but don't be fooled by the romanticized idea of warrior women choosing glory. In reality, the story of female gladiators is one of humiliation, forced sexual display, and the darkest excesses of Roman. Unlike male gladiators who could at least cling to the illusion of honor of fame, women in the arena were treated as grotesque novelties. They weren't celebrated as equal. They were mocked, sexualized, and paraded like freaks in a carnival for Rome. Forcing women into the sand wasn't just about combat, it was about degradation. The fight was only part of the spectacle. What was done to these women before, during, and after the arena was far more horrifying. So how did this begin? Why did society built on hyper-masculine ideals of military glory ever place women in the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum? The origins lie in Rome's obsession with dominance to the Romans. The amphitheater was not merely a stage for sport, it was political, a place to demonstrate absolute control over human bodies. Every gladiatorial match was a display of Rome's power slaves, defeated criminals, executed conquered peoples forced to fight one another. By introducing women into this environment, the spectacle reached a new level of perversion. It wasn't enough to see men butchered. The crowd demanded the shock of seeing women, symbols of fertility, family, and modesty, dragged through filth and forced to kill. Roman writers themselves were scandalized. The satirist juvenile writing in the 1st century had mocked aristocratic women who trained to fight in the arena, sneering that they disgraced their families by sweating and bleeding. Like men, Cassius Dio, the historian, recorded with disgust how imprint omission stage games featuring women fighting dwarves purely for public amusement to the elite female combat was shocking because it blurred the sacred Roman boundary between male honor and female modesty. But that shock value is exactly why most of these women were not volunteers. They were slaves, captives of war, were condemned criminals to roam their gender, made them perfect tools of humiliation. Forcing a man into the arena tested his strength, forcing a woman into the stripped her dignity. This was Rome's cruelty at its most calculated. Imagine the preparations a young woman perhaps captured in Germania or Britannia finds herself chained in a gladiatorial school. Her hair is cut her drift away. She is marched naked before crowds as trainers evaluate her body, not for skill, but for spectacle. If her appearance excites the crowd, she'll be trained to fight. If not, she may be tossed into the arena unprepared to be for the audience's laughter. The training itself was brutal. Roman gladiatorial schools are moody when notorious for their cruelty. Women, like their male counterparts, endured days of weapon drills, mock battles, and punishments for failure. But unlike men, women were often forced to fight in minimal clothing, their bodies deliberately exposed for the crowd. Ancient graffiti and carvings suggest that female gladiators fought with bare chests. The humiliation made part of the entertainment. It was not simply about death, it was about the public destruction of dignity. And yet some of these women did learn to fight. Archaeological evidence, such as the relief from Helicon access, shows 2 female gladiators named Amazon and Achilla squaring. Shields and swords awarded wooden staves of honor. After a match, their names borrowed from legendary warrior women of myth suggest that Rome relished mocking them by dressing them as symbols of heroism, only to degrade them in sand. But the horrors didn't end. Training yard, once inside the amphitheater, the degradation reached its peak. Female gladiators weren't usually matched against other women in fair combat. They were paired against dwarves, wild animals, or seasoned male fighters. The idea wasn't the skill, but to humiliate them. To watch a woman bleed, crawl, or scream in the sand was the spectacle. The crowd roared not just at the blood, but at the sexual charge of the scene. Roman audiences were notorious for a erotic violence in female just became objects of grotesque fascination. Some were forced to fight topless or nearly naked, their bodies smeared in oil, glisten under the sun. Writers record emperors reclining as they watched, laughing, drinking, and betting on which woman would be killed first. And when the battle ended, survival was no mercy. Female gladiators who lived were often paraded through the streets, subjected to jeering and sexual abuse, and forced to serve in brothels. Attached to the amphitheater, Rome's appetite for humiliation endless. For some women, the arena was only the beginning of lifelong degradation. But here is where the story grows darker. Still, Rome's emperors didn't just use female gladiators as a sideshow. They weaponized them as political tools. Emperor Domitian staged deliberate spectacles. When noble women were forced to fight, these weren't slaves or captives, but members of Rome's upper classes humiliated publicly to demonstrate that no one, not even aristocratic women, was beyond the emperors. Imagine being a senator's daughter dressed in armor, forced to fight under the gaze of Rome's elite. Your family's on a stripped away. Your body exposed, your blood soaking the sand, all to prove that the emperor controlled not only life and death, also dignity itself for these women. The arena was not only physical torment, but social execution. By the 2nd century AD, the phenomenon of female gladiators grew so controversial that Emperor Septimus Severus banned them outright. He claimed it was indecent for women to fight in the arena, but by then the damage was done. For nearly a century, Rome had used women as tools of entertainment, humiliation, and political propaganda, leaving behind scars that echoed long after the ended. The archaeological silence speaks volumes. The remains of female gladiators are rare because Rome never saw them as worthy of memorial. Their names, like Amazon and a killer, survive only as cool nicknames carved on stone. Real identities, their families, their stories, their voices were raised by a society that treated their suffering a spectacle, and yet hints remain. In 1996, archaeologists unearthed a skeleton in Southwark, London, to be that of a female gladiator buried with oil lamps depicting gladiatorial combat. Her bones showed signs of heavy training weapon use and repeated injuries. She was far from Rome, yet a body bore the scars of the same brutality. It is reminder that this horror wasn't confined to the Colosseum. It stretched across the empire, wherever Rome's shadow fell. But what happened inside the arena was only part of the story. The real nightmare laying what was done to these women behind closed doors before the crowd ever. Sexual exploitation, forced entertainment for elite guests, and rituals designed to degrade them, even off the sands. What we know from Roman records suggests that the worst of their suffering didn't happen under the sun, but in the shadows of the amphitheater wall. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping through the back corridors of the Colosseum. The roar of the crowd fades, replaced by the creak of wooden gates, the stench of sweat and blood, the muffled sobs of the condemned. These are the spaces the public never saw, the underworld beneath the spectacle for the women forced to fight as gladiators. This was where the true nightmare unfolded. The underground chambers of Rome's amphitheaters were more than holding cells. They were cages of humiliation, prisoners chained in the dark, animals kept in cramped pits, and among them women stripped of their humanity. Before ever stepping into the light, ancient sources tell us that before female gladiators were pushed into the arena, they were paraded like livestock trainers' guards, even visiting dignitaries. Examine them as though they were exotic creatures. Their worth wasn't judged only by skill with a weapon, but by their body, their appearance, there to titillate the crowd. Unlike male gladiators, who at times trained for years before their first fight, women were rushed into the arena. They weren't supposed to become skilled warriors. Their value was shocked, and novelty. A man who survived years of combat could rise in rank, win fame, perhaps even freedom, but a woman who survived was a problem. She was a reminder. Rome's indecency, many were quietly executed afterward or sold to brothels so the spectacle would not lose its mistake. The sexual exploitation was systematic. Roman writers and satirists, uncomfortable with the idea of women fighting, often emphasized their sexual availability. Instead, Tiavana sneered the aristocratic ladies who trained as gladiators, also entertained their trainers in bed. Suetonius, in his biographies of emperors, hinted that many female fighters were délites, forced into roles that blur the line between prostitute and gladiator. To the Roman mind, once a woman stepped into the sand, she ceased to be a wife, a daughter, or a mother. She became a public object. The amphitheater brothels are perhaps the darkest part. Play story we know from surviving records that many amphitheaters across the empire included small side buildings or rooms rented to prostitutes. The crowds who came for blood often wanted other entertainments after the games, but what isn't taught in classrooms is that the women who had fought that day were often dragged straight from the arena into these rooms where the victorious or defeated, they were handed over to paying customers as though their bodies were just another part part of the ticket price archaeologists excavating Pompeii. David Graffiti, scrawled on brothel walls boasting of encounters with gladiatrix, is the crude inscriptions read like advertisements' name. Prices, crude descriptions of acts the very same women who had been cheered or mocked in the sand. By the hour, once the crowd dispersed, their degradation was total, and the emperors encouraged it. Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, became infamous for staging grotesque games, according to Cassius Dio. He women against dwarfs or animals, not because they stood a chance, but because the sheer absurdity entertained the crowd afterward. Many of these women were forced into feasts, where the emperor's guests could gawk at them, touch them, or worse, they were living trophies of. Cruelty paraded in chains through banquets drenched in wine, and excess, the rituals surrounding their preparation, were just as disturbing before entering the arena. Gladiators, male and female, were expected to oil their bodies for men. This was a practical measure, part of athletic tradition for women. It became a spectacle of exposure. Ancient sources describe guards deliberately smearing oil across women's bare skin, lingering in ways that left no doubt this was performance in the bright sun of the amphitheater. Listening bodies were part of the entertainment, and then came the weapons. Unlike men who were trained to master heavy arms, women were often given deliberately mismatched or oversized weapons. A short woman might be forced to have a massive shield, another might. Canada Net in Trident mocked as a parody of male gladiators. The crowd laughed at their clumsy movements, cheering more for their humiliation than their skill. Sometimes they were forced to fight barehanded against armed opponents, their helplessness drawing gears. Every corner of the arena, when animals were involved, the horror escalated. Female gladiators were sometimes pitted against wild beasts, lions, leopards, even trained dogs starved for days to make them savage, unlike men who might. Receive Alma, women were often thrown in nearly naked. The spectacle was not the kill, but the terror. Imagine the sand, stained with blood as a lion, clawed a screaming woman, the crowd roaring, not in pity, but in delight even when. Survived, the scars were permanent, torn flesh, mangled limbs, a lifetime of agony carved into her body. But what about those who fought bravely, who somehow won? Did they earn on her like men might rarely victory fray? In the arena was often treated as comedy. Cassius Dio writes that crowds laughed when women defeated male opponents, mocking the men for losing to the weaker sex. Victorious women were sometimes dressed in mock triumphal robes and paraded through the arena. Heroes, but as jokes, their courage became Rome's punchline. The rituals of death were just as cruel in gladiatorial combat. The final decision of life or death was often left to the crowd or the emperor. For male gladiators, the crowd. Plead for mercy. If the fight was honorable for women, mercy was rarely granted to spare. A woman would be to treat her as equal to a man. Instead, the crowd demanded execution. Many female gladiators were killed even after surrender. Through the heart is the crowd jeered. Their bodies were dragged away like refuse, dumped into mass graves with criminals and slaves. Yet there were exceptions. Glimpses of individuals who somehow left a mark. The relief from hallucinosis depicting Amazon suggests that occasionally women were granted missio, released from combat. The inscription records that the fight ended in status missile, meaning both women fought so bravely that they were released without a kill. Perhaps the crowd was impressed, perhaps. Emperor was in a rare, generous mood, but even then these women were returned to the shadow. Their brief moment of glory did not buy them freedom. And what are those from noble families forced into combat for political theater? Here the humiliation was even sharper. Roman moralists wrote with disgust of wealthy women training with wooden swords in private gyms, preparing to display themselves before the emperor for their family. It was devastating. A daughter who fought in the arena was considered forever dishonored. A lineage painted her marriage prospects destroyed even if she survived. She returned not as a woman of standing, but as an outcast, marked by the shame of the arena. The degradation extended into religion. Roman festivals often included gladiatorial games. What age does offerings to the gods female gladiators therefore weren't just fighting? They were sacrifices. In some rituals, women were dressed as mythological figures before being thrown into combat. One might be clothed as Venus, goddess of love then, fight an armed man until her blood stained the sand. Another might be styled as an Amazon warrior, mocked as she failed to live up to the legend. Their deaths became twisted acts of worship, spectacles of divine irony for the Roman crowd. And when the games ended, the suffering continued. Surviving female gladiators were often forced into prostitution, serving not just the common crowd, but sometimes the very emperors who had ordered their battles. Ancient texts describe women taken directly from the arena to serve. Cast of feasts, their bodies became commodities, their scars displayed as erotic curiosities in the dim candlelight of Roman banquets. Senators and generals boasted of bedding women who had fought lions by day. The humiliation was complete. By the 2nd century, criticism grew louder. Philosophers and historians began to argue that female gladiators represented the moral decay of Rome. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus railed against the games discussed by the sight of women degraded in play. Even the Emperor Septimus Severus, who had once encouraged spectacle, eventually banned female gladiators entirely, declaring it unfit for Rome's dignity. His ban, however, was less about mercy and more about shame. Rome indulged too far, and the presence of women in the sand had become a symbol of excess. But by then, countless women had already died in the arena. Their names erased, their dignity stripped, their blood poured out for the entertainment of the masses. Their stories of fame, scraps of graffiti, carved reliefs, scattered bones. Yet when pieced together, they reveal a truth far darker than the romanticized myths of warrior women. They reveal a system designed not to honor, but to humiliate, not to thank, but to destroy humanity in the most public way possible. And yet there is one more layer of horror still to uncover, because what was done to women in the Colosseum wasn't limited to combat prostitution or humiliation. Some female gladiators were used. Executions rituals, so grotesque, so calculated that even ancient chronicles could barely stomach describing them. These were the damn Mesa, or the best years. The punishments by beasts, where women weren't fighters at all, but props in obscene dramas of... Picture this. The sound of the Colosseum has already been soaked, read by combat. Dozens of gladiators have fought men and women alike in the crowd. Appetite for blood should be satisfied, but it isn't not yet, because the Roman people demanded more than battles. They demanded theater, and the most horrifying theater of all was the damnation. Ad bestias, the condemnation to beasts. For many women condemned to this fate, there was no fight, no chance of survival. They were not given swords. Fields instead, they were dressed in costumes mocking mythological figures. A woman might be dressed as leather from the Greek legend, then thrown naked into the arena with a wild swan. Trained to attack another might be styled as Danny, a chain does golden. Start over her before soldiers assaulted her in front of tens of thousands of spectators. Some were closed. As pacifier, the queen who, according to myth, mated with a bull and then tied to animals in grotesque reenactments meant to humiliate and kill these ones. Is toll behind closed doors? They were staged spectacles engineered to shock. To the Roman audience, watching women humiliated in this way was entertainment to the women themselves. It was a death sentence masked as ritual theater. The play in Cassius Dio records that under Emperor Nero, women condemned to beasts were forced into scenes so grotesque they blurred the line between punishment and sexual assault. Their execution was entertainment, but their suffering was the point. The more humiliating, the Roman crowd was addicted not just to blood, but to shame, and the cruelty didn't stop with mythological reenactment. Many women were simply stripped naked and thrown to wild animals. Lions, panthers, even packs of dogs starved for. To make them frenzied inscriptions of mosaics from North Africa, depict scenes of women being mauled in front of cheering audiences. There was no dignity, no resistance, no survival, just a slow, savage death beneath the roar of tens of thousands of spectators. Why women? Why did Rome feel the need to subject them to these extremes? The answer lies in power. Forcing men to fight was about control, but forcing women to suffer in public struck deeper. Women represented the continuity of family, the owner of households, the very idea of modesty in Roman culture. By humiliating them in the arena, Rome sent a message: no one, not even mothers or daughters, was safe from imperial power. The political symbolism was impossible to ignore. When EMP changed these executions, they weren't just entertaining the crowd, they were reminding everyone that they, and they alone, controlled life. Death and dignity. A senator's daughter could be dragged into the sand alongside a slave girl from the province's boat, to the same fate. The arena made all women equal, and degradation, some emperors reveled in it more than others. Commission remembered for his cruelty. Forced noble women into gladiatorial combat and into beast condemnations. Nero obsessed. Theatrical excess staged elaborate scenes of female suffering that blended theater with execution. Even Commodus, the infamous emperor who fought in the arena himself, is said to have arranged fights where women were made to battle beasts purely to play his twisted sense of spectacle. But not every woman was condemned. A few managed to carve out strange forms of celebrity inscription, survive praising women who fought bravely, their name etched alongside men's in gladiatorial graffiti. What time is it? In Achilles suggests that the crowd could on rare occasions admire their courage, but admiration never erased humiliation. Even in Victory, female gladiators were mocked as novelties freaks who amused Rome for daring to wield AI. Archaeology provides chilling confirmation. In 2000, a grave was discovered in Southwark, London, believed to belong to a female gladiator. She was buried with oil lamps depicting gladiatorial combat, her bones showing signs of repeated TR from weapons training. Yet she lay far from Rome, her body marked by scars that told the same story of cruelty that played out across the empire. This wasn't just a Roman phenomenon, it stretched from Britain to Asia Minor, wherever amphitheaters rose and demanded blood. The silence in the historical record is just as haunting. We know the names of countless male gladiators: Spartacus, Flammer, Priscus. Their exploits were recorded, their victories celebrated, but women almost. The names survive only as nicknames carved in stone. Amazon, Achillea, their real names, their families, their lives all erased. Rome recorded their humiliation, but not their humanity. Why? Because to remember them fully. Romantic, the horror, easier instead to bury them in shallow graves, strip their memory of dignity, and let time wash away their voices. And yet the fragments remain enough for us to glimpse the truth. So what legacy did female gladiators leave? Paradoxically, they became symbols of Rome's excess. Philosophers and historians of later centuries pointed to them as evidence of the empire's moral decay. The Stoics railed against the games, disgusted by the sight of women reduced to indignities. Septimus Severus banned female gladiators outright in the early 3rd century, declaring their presence unfit for Rome's dignity. But the ban was not mercy, it was shame. Rome didn't want to stop humiliating women, it wanted to stop being reminded of its own depravity. And yet, even as the official game shifted away from female fighters, the idea lingered in memory and art. Centuries later, medieval writers spoke of Roman women in the arena as symbols of a fallen empire renaissance. Autism poets turned them into exotic figures, tragic heroines who blurred the line between fact and myth, but the reality was far darker than any painting. These were not heroines. They were slaves, captives, and daughters sacrificed for spectacle. In that final moments, a woman standing in the arena, the crowd cheering the emperor, watching the smell of blood thick in the air. She knows there will be no mercy. Perhaps she fights desperately, swinging her weapon until exhaustion drags her to the sand. Perhaps she screams as a lion tears into her flesh. Perhaps she is executed at the emperor's gesture, a sword plunged into her chest as the crowd cheers, and then silence, her body dragged away, dumped into the pits with thousands of others hurt. Lost forever. The history is not forgotten. Completely, archaeology continues to uncover traces of their existence. Graves, graffiti, relief carvings, skeletal remains. Each fragment, whispers of the women who lived, suffered, and died. Room's entertainment, they remind us that behind the marble grandeur of the Colosseum lies a history built on cruelty. The story of female gladiators is not one of empowerment or glory. It is a story of systematic humiliation of women used as tools. In entertainment and propaganda, Rome called them gladiatrix. Today, we call them victims. And the next time you see the Colosseum, whether in person, in a photograph, or in a film, remember this. Those stones are not just monuments to Romans. There are tombs for the countless men and women, especially women who bled and died within their walls. Their screams may have faded, but their story remains echoing across 2,000 years as a warning of what happens when human life becomes nothing more than a spectacle. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel.